See so many people here. Welcome to our series of language and sustainable development webinars. The series we started because we wanted to bring together research on sustainable development that focuses on language. So there's all kinds of projects going on different aspects of research. And we thought it would be nice to bring together all of the research on language because we wanted to see what kinds of themes are emerging and whether there are some synergies that we can draw, but also importantly, what we can learn from each other in doing this research. So today we are going to give a talk on our project. We're going to give a talk for about 35 minutes, and then we'll have questions which will be moderated through the chat. Thanks very much to everybody for coming. We are looking forward to sort of having a lively discussion. So I'm just going to start by sharing the slides for the talk. Oh, really, really good. Stop share. Okay, great. So we were going to give this talk jointly with our colleague, Joseph Mwansa from Zambia, but unfortunately, he has been held up with some family matters and is not able to join us. But luckily, because last week when we were sort of discussing the talk, we tried it out and the internet was very bad from Zambia. We had already made a recording for it, so it's really good you're going to be able to at least hear him. So our talk today is on our project, and the title for this talk is Bringing the Outside In, Emerging Insights in Language Use and Language Attitudes in Zambia. So this is the outline of the talk. I am going to talk about the project in terms of giving an overview of our overall project, and then I'll talk about the context of the research in education policies as well, and then talk about the research questions. And then I'll pass on to Colin to talk about methodology and the training of the research assistants. The next part was going to be the part that Joseph was going to talk about, and he will inform of these recordings, but I'm just going to sort of act as a commentator on this part. So this is where we give our initial findings on Zambia, where we conducted teacher interviews, classroom interaction, and some parent interviews. And then we'll sort of give some tentative conclusions at this stage. So our project is entitled Bringing the Outside In, Merging Local Language and Literacy Practices to Enhance Classroom Learning and Achievement, and is part of the Global Challenges Research Fund project from the British Academy, which is going to run for about 27 months. So it started in May 2019 and is going to end in August 2021. So the aim of the project is to examine the ways in which multilingual practices can be harnessed to enhance experiences of education. And the reason for this is because in general, in most African countries, there is the practice of having monolingual language and education policies, whereas actually most of the countries are multilingual. So we are trying to see whether what is experienced by the learners outside of the classroom can be brought into the classroom by thinking about having multilingual teaching policies. I am not able to move. Right, so this is the team from the University of Essex, together with me, Tracy Costley and Hannah Gibson, and we're very happy and lucky to have Colin Riley as our postdoc. And then we are collaborating with 3 countries, Botswana, Tanzania, and Zambia. In each of the places, we've got a co-investigator and 2 research assistants. The picture that you see here is of the 3 co-Is. So closest to the screen is Gaston Makunda from Botswana, and in the middle is Mompoloki Bagwatsi from Botswana. And then talking animatedly at the very end is Joseph Mwansa from Zambia. So this is the launch of our project that we had last year in September. So this is a picture from the Senate room at the University of Zambia, and in the middle is the Deputy Vice Chancellor. A really, really wonderful occasion. In the back, you can see all of the image of the previous Vice Chancellor. They are just waiting for a female Vice Chancellor to take over at some point. And of course, China has arrived in Zambia. So this is one of the newest buildings that we have at the moment. That's the Confucius Institute. And this is where we had our launch our lounge meeting, and there was really, really nice facilities, all very swanky, nothing of what I experienced when I was doing my undergraduate studies in Zambia. I think the only saving grace of this picture is that the sign for the University of Zambia is at least bigger than the one that says Confucius Institute. So as part of that launch project, we also, something that we want to carry out in all of the countries is to engage with the local community that's there. So with PhD students, with colleagues who are working in this area, to have a better understanding of kind of what's going on. So this is one of those sessions in Zambia, talking to colleagues from the University of Zambia. And we're really lucky to have loads of a good interaction with them. And of course, we had great food. I'm sorry to do this to you at lunchtime. So this is a fantastic bream from the Zambezi that we had a really, really great time there. Okay, so moving on to some business. In post-independence, most parts of Africa in the 1960s, nationhood and national unity was very important. And one of the things that was used to bring that about was to have one nation, one language policies. So the picture that you see here on the right, the person on the right is the former president of Zambia, Kenneth Kaunda, post-independence president, holding his signature handkerchief there, and in the middle is Julius Nyerere, and then following them there is Mugabe, before he got tainted, shall we say. So it's really, these are really great times. These are safari suit times. So in this safari suit times, the policies were that we want to sort of make the nations have a better identity, build national unity, and also guard against things like tribalism. So in a way, choosing one language and say that we are all going to be united behind one language was the way that most of the countries went. And then of course, this fed into language in education policies. So I'm now just going to talk very briefly across the three countries to just sort of say what's actually going on in each of those contexts that we are looking at. So in Botswana, it was a similar kind of thing. The national person at that time was Saseret Sekama, and he also had a great vision of having nation building and national identity as being key in a post-independence Botswana. And interestingly, before in the colonial times, there was a little bit more of other languages appearing in teaching in schools in Botswana. But post-independence, things became more restrictive and there was much more backing for having Setswana. Of course, this was seen as very important for building national identity. So in Botswana, English is the official language, Setswana is the national language, 78% of the population are said to speak Setswana. At home, there are about 25 to 28 different languages spoken across the country. One thing that is very significant, of course, in Botswana is that there's severe language endangerment. Of these 25 to 28 languages, about 12 of these are Khoisan languages with moribund populations where there's very high language endangerment. So this is our colleague Mampoloki Bagwatsi at this launch event that we had in Unza, talking to us about Botswana language and education policy. So in the first year of schooling, Setswana is the medium of instruction and English is taught as a subject. In the second year onwards, English takes over as the medium of instruction and Setswana becomes a subject. In Tanzania, there are about 130 languages, and at independence, it was one of the few countries in the region which chose an African language, Swahili, to be the official language. Literacy is at about 80%. Other languages in Tanzania, the remaining languages in those 130 languages, are not really encouraged, and in most cases, they're really even discouraged. They're not used in government or education or media, or in any official platforms. There's some very nice work that's gone on to map the languages in Tanzania. So this is an image from the Atlas of the Languages of Tanzania from 2009 from colleagues at the University of Dar es Salaam, which kind of just gives you an impression of the complexity of languages. There are many languages, not all of them are represented on this map, but it's just kind of to give you an impression of how many languages that they are represented. So this is Gasta Mapunda talking to us about Tanzania language and education policy. In Tanzania, Swahili is the language that is used in primary education exclusively. English is used in secondary education onwards. When Swahili is used as the medium of instruction in primary schools, English is not taught as a subject in state schools. And overall, the English proficiency is quite low. Coming to Zambia, there are about 72 languages, which are sort of represented in sort of 30 language clusters. The official language is English. In contrast to Botswana and Tanzania, there are also 7 national languages, which are chosen based on the region, north, south, east, west kind of region. Literacy is between 71 to 85%. So this is an image that is showing the languages of Zambia, and the different colors are kind of showing maybe those 30 clusters, and within those clusters, there are many languages involved in there. In contrast to the situation where, the map that we saw, the beautiful map from Tanzania, which is from 2009, this is a really, really old map from Zambia. It's sort of the only linguistic map that you have. In fact, you can see sort of on the bottom on the right, the price says, it's 1 kwacha, and 1 kwacha, I can assure you, is not going to buy you, very much. Just to contextualize, the cases that we're going to talk about later are going to be in northern Zambia. So this is the part which is yellow on the map. And there you can see there are many, each of the little sort of squares that you can see are many different languages. And that whole region, Bemba is used as the medium of instruction. In fact, the language that we're going to talk about is Namwanga. There's a little square at the top of the slide in the brown area. In that area as well, this is all considered to be in the north, and therefore the medium of instruction is predominantly Bemba. So we are going to look at a situation where Namwanga is sort of spoken in the wider community. So the Zambian the language and education policy in Zambia, previously it always used to be that it was one of the 7 regional languages which was used, but there was a real turnaround in 2013 where it was changed from preschool to grade 4. Instead of it being one of the 7 national languages, it became a familiar Zambian language. This was a really, really important stage because it meant that regional languages could also be used in teaching and be used as mediums of instruction. So other languages in a region, whatever is familiar to the kids, other than just the national languages, can also be used according to this curriculum framework of 2013. Initial literacy is encouraged to be taught in Zambian languages, and then from grade 5 upwards, English is the medium of instruction. And then English is taught as a subject from grade 2. And the idea is that you start with initial literacy in Zambian languages, and then you shift into literacy in English in grade 3, or you transition into literacy in English in the 3rd grade. So some commonalities between the 3 contexts is that one thing that you see very much, and that we also got from last week's talk on Gambia, for those of you who attended that, is that the centralization, that government workers, including teachers, are posted to different regions, which might mean that sometimes they might go to an area where they don't speak the language. And one of the reasons for doing this is also to curb against tribalism. So you don't want to be, for example, in Zambia in particular, they usually don't want to make postings of a teacher to an area where you speak the language. So you have to be sent to a sort of different area, but of course that entails that you go to an area where you might not speak the language. One of the things that's also common that we saw is that there's a contrast between regional languages and national languages. So this contrast is something that we would like to bring out in sort of further research. And then for these 3 contexts that we chose, they are all, Anglophone. English is the language that is kind of coming in. The other thing that we see in particular for Tanzania and Botswana is that there's one big dominant language in Tanzania, Swahili, and in Botswana, Setswana, which is set against all of the other languages. And this is really, really a big thing, at least for these 2 contexts. And then the differences is we see quite a big contrast in the progression from primary to secondary school. And we're interested in this because usually the medium of instruction can be in a local language in the primary school, but tends to be English in secondary school in all of the 3 contexts. So then the question is that could that be affecting achievement in some way? So in Tanzania, there's 56% achievement in terms of progressing from primary to secondary school. In Zambia, 64%. In Botswana, it says 99%. And for each of these numbers, one has to be a little bit cautious because one sees different numbers according to different reports. So it's kind of something which, again, one has to sort of verify in some way. So I come to the research questions. So our general research questions are sort of 3. The first 2 are interrelated. So we want to find out from the project overall what language and literacy practices are promoted and valued and expected in schools. from the policies that are there, and then contrasting with that with what are the language and literacy practices that are promoted and valued and expected outside of the school. So what do actually people use and what do they consider to be valuable? And then something that we're not going to talk about necessarily today is we would like to work towards trying to understand or find out how could we use a translanguaging pedagogy or practices to develop teaching in schools so that this can enhance teaching and learning. So try to use what's on the outside, the multilingualism, to bring it into the classroom so that they could be better teaching. So here I'm going to pass on to Colin to start the methodology part, and I'm supposed to move the slides, so he's going to say next to me each time. There you go.
Thanks, Nancy. So to answer those research questions, we've adopted an ethnographic approach to our research. And we've done this mainly because of what linguistic ethnography allows you to do. So as Chris and Blackledge have noted, it enables you to study the local and immediate actions of individuals from their point of view, while also importantly allowing you to understand how these actions are embedded in wider social contexts. And multilingualism and how multilingualism manifests in different settings is complex, and linguistic ethnography provides a tool for developing an in-depth understanding of that complexity. Next slide, please, Nancy. So at the start of our project, we developed 3 principles underlying how we wanted to approach our ethnography and to guide how we work together on the project more generally. And these principles are researching multilingually, researching collaboratively, and researching responsibly. So I'll quickly run through each of the principles, what it means, and then how it affects our project. So the first principle we have here is researching multilingually. So we have a large team on the project, and we all bring our different multilingual repertoires to the project. And we view multilingualism as a valuable resource in education, so in the object of our study. So we also want to view it as a valuable resource in how we actually go about doing our research. So this means that we're not restricting ourselves to using particular languages or doing things monolingually. And we want to open up a space for languages other than English to be able to be used on the project. So when our research assistants are collecting data, they're in multilingual environments, and it just wouldn't make sense for them to collect the data monolingually. It wouldn't be the most effective thing to do. So we don't really see any reason to be strictly monolingual or English only in other aspects of the project, such as when we're doing data analysis, or when we're discussing project issues, or when we're sharing data. Next slide, please, Nancy. So the next principle is researching collaboratively. And this is really to emphasize that this is a team working together. It's not an individual effort, but it's a collective and a collaborative one. And our collaborators include all our members in the research team, but also our participants and the wider communities and stakeholders that we engage with. And as we are a large team, currently split across 5 countries and doing data collection in 3 different countries, there's a potential danger that this could feel like 3 separate projects. So collaboration is really important for everyone and for the research to feel like part of one larger project. So we ensure that everyone on the team, so all the co-investigators, myself, all the research assistants, have opportunities to feed into everything that we do. So we can share ideas, feedback, experiences, and learning across the whole team. So for example, everyone has a chance to comment on all of the research instruments that were being developed by the country leads and could provide feedback on these. And tools could be shared and adapted between different research sites. Next slide, please, Nancy. So as another example of our collaboration, we have a WhatsApp group that all our research assistants are in, and we can use to discuss different things about the project. So recently we've been discussing some of the interviews that were collected in Zambia, and our research assistants in Zambia have been sharing some of their experiences from doing data collection with our other teams who are about to start the data collection. Next slide, please, Nancy. So our final principle is researching responsibly. And this is really just to build in flexibility within our research and within the project. So the contexts that we're collecting data in are all different. So we do have to adapt and respond to those different contexts, and then also to other unforeseen things which might arise, such as the current coronavirus situation, which has affected our data collection, and we've had to come up with new ideas to respond to the current situation. Next slide, please, Nancy. So that was our principles. Now I want to just talk briefly about the induction and training sessions that we have conducted for our research assistants. So these sessions were collaboratively designed, so everyone on the team had a chance to comment on a few different iterations of the training sessions and all the various processes, documents and guidelines that we've produced for the project that were going to be discussed in the sessions. And the sessions were facilitated by myself and specific country leads, so Joseph in Zambia and Gaster in Tanzania. And we've not yet conducted the training session in Botswana with Montpellier, but for the training sessions in Zambia and Tanzania, me and Joseph and me and Gaster sat down basically for a whole day and went through in a lot of detail what we would be doing during the sessions, and then made any further revisions that were necessary. There were also multilingual sessions, so I think importantly, English wasn't the only language that was used during the sessions, and there was a flexibility built into them. So our research teams all had different backgrounds, experiences and expertise, and the data collection in each country is not completely identical, so we could focus the sessions on what would be most beneficial. And the reason for me conducting these sessions alongside our country leads, so there are a few reasons. So one, my background is in linguistic ethnography. Two, so that there is some consistency between the different teams on the project. And three, I think quite importantly, so that the individual country teams and our research assistants know that they're part of this larger project, and also know that there are support structures in place for them while they're doing work on the project. So I'm just going to run through a few pictures now. So this is just the front page of our research assistant handbook. So this is for the Zambia research assistants. So all research assistants on the project have a copy of this handbook, which is about 50 pages long and contains everything that they could possibly need to do their work on the project. Next slide, please, Nancy. And this is our agenda for our induction session for our RAs at the University of Dar es Salaam. So you can sort of see through the different items there, the main purpose of these sessions was to introduce the RAs to the various processes and protocols on the project, such as how we communicate with each other, how we record, store and manage our data. But then also importantly, they were very interactive and active sessions, which allowed the RAs to get a chance to develop the skills that they'll be using when they're doing the ethnographic work on the project. Next slide, please, Nancy. And here is just a picture of everything that we really needed to do our inductions and our linguistic ethnography training. So some posters and pens, some recording devices, and then various miscellaneous items, including some rocks, a ball of string, and a magnifying glass for some of the activities that we did. Next slide, please, Nancy. And here is a picture of our University of Zambia RAs. So Chileshi on the left and Martha on the right, setting up some of our equipment during the training session. And yeah, this is our University of Dar es Salaam team. So Gaster, our country lead, on the left, and Edna next to him in the middle, and Hassan after our induction session at the University of Dar es Salaam. That was quite a quick run through of sort of our principles, our approach, and these training sessions. So happy to answer any questions anyone has about them during the Q&A at the end. But now I'll hand back to Nancy, and we can hear from Joseph about some of our data.
Okay, excellent. Thanks very much, Colin. So this is Joseph Mwansa, and I'm going to sort of play some of the clips that we have with the slides that are coming, and give some commentary where it's necessary.
Good afternoon. My name is Joseph Mwansa. I'm going to talk about the study that we conducted in Zambia.
Okay, so this is just to talk about the context.
This study was done in the northern part of the country, two provinces, Northern and Mchinga provinces, where Bemba, which is one of the 7 regional official languages that are used in Zambia, is used as a medium of instruction in the first 4 years of primary school. There are a number of other languages in the region. And in this study, we'll talk about the use of Bemba in an area which is predominantly in Namwanga area.
So this is an image of Kasama. So when you arrive in Kasama, this is sort of the high street. There's there on the left it says Twafane general dealers. So Twafane is we should help each other. Lively. Also some nice banana sellers on the right there. So here Joseph is going to talk about the contrast in terms of positioning of Namwanga and Bemba.
In terms of the population of speakers of these languages, the Mambwe Namwanga group consisted of 3.2% of Zambia's population in 2010 census. The population at that time was 11.7 million people. Namwanga was used by 1.2% of Zambia's population in the 2010 census, and by 20.7% of people in Mchinga province. In the same area, Bemba was used by 46.9%. This shows that, in fact, Bemba is much more predominant in that area, not just because it is the regional language, but it's also the fact that other towns in Mchinga province have very big populations of Bemba speakers. In the same census of 2010, only 0.3% of Bemba speakers reported using one of the languages from Mambwe or Namwanga group, while 38.9% of Namwanga speakers used Bemba widely in everyday interactions.
Okay, so here he sort of starts to talk about the teacher's views, and in the research that was conducted there, data was collected by interviewing teachers, school administrators and parents, and also having focus group discussions with teachers and learners, and also observation of lessons. So here Joseph talks about teachers' views.
Many teachers felt that Zambian languages were helping learners to acquire literacy quite early. They didn't seem to have many challenges in learning literacy in Zambian, in Bemba. And in Nakonde, teachers claimed that it didn't take long for learners to adjust from Namwanga to Bemba. That is, from the Namwanga that they spoke in their homes to using it to learn in school. Some said that it takes just a few weeks upon entry in school, that learners can become proficient in Bemba within a term.
So again, this is talking about how do the learners adjust when they come from a home where predominantly speaking Namwanga, when they sort of go into school where it's Bemba as a medium of instruction.
Now in Nakonde, when learners enter schools, first grade, in the first few weeks, teachers said that they sometimes answered their questions in Namwanga. When they posed questions in Bemba.
So one thing that Joseph went on to talk about quite a bit, and I'm sorry that I sort of just cut his recording there, was that some of the Namwanga teachers were given an opportunity by some program to sort of have teaching be taught in Namwanga, but their claim or what they said was that Namwanga is very difficult to teach, so that even the Namwanga speakers were defaulting to use Bembas, and this might be, to do with materials. The next thing we want to show is some classroom interactions, but I thought it just might be nice to show you an impression of what schools look like. So this is a school in Lusaka that we visited when we were sort of there. And it's just sort of to give you that an impression of what it looks like. So schools in Zambia are usually this color. They are usually white and blue. If you're driving or going by bus out to the north, you're seeing schools spotted in this color. So this is just to sort of give you an impression. They usually also have a motto, education for a better life, in particular for this one. And also at the front, they usually tend to have some kind of mission statement. So here, very, very sort of ambitious to provide quality education that will answer the needs of the community through a well-motivated and committed staff. So now we are sort of going to listen to a classroom interaction, and maybe I will start with Joseph first giving an explanation, and then we'll listen to the actual recording in the class, which is not that great, but once you have the explanation and with the highlighting, I hope that you'll be sort of able to follow that. So first we listen to Joseph giving the explanation.
This is an example of a classroom interaction. And this is taken from a lesson in a rural setting within Nakonde. What was noticed in this class, which started with the teacher asking learners to tell a folk tale, and one of the volunteers actually told the whole story in Namwanga. The teacher didn't seem to mind this, and in fact used the story to ask the questions that are on this in this extract. So she was asking about the things that were mentioned in the story. The highlighted areas, the yellow indicates where the learners were answering in Namwanga. For example, one learner said, Easy Pondo, which means criminals. Now, the teacher followed up this one later and recast it into Bemba. This is shown in green. You can see it says Ifipondo. So it's just a difference in terms of the initial sounds. Another incident was when this learner said, Ukuomba inchito, which means he worked. He did some work. And the teacher changed that one to Alebomba inchito. Another example again, where the learner says, we made a sentence in Namwanga that the hair did not do any work, and the teacher recast that one into Bemba. So which means the hair did not do any work. So this was much more common in the rural context, where teachers were just correcting this by giving the Bemba version.
It was very nice to hear Joseph circumventing that VW cluster and able to say it as a non-native speaker of Namwanga. So this is what actually happened in the classroom. I'll try to sort of point to the relevant parts, but you might be able to get it. It's very interesting because when the teacher speaks at the end, this part, she says, she's recapping what the student says. So it's really interesting because the student has spoken in Namwanga, but then she says, what has she says? She has just said, and then she says in Bemba, almost as if it's a direct quote. So in terms of the learners' interactions, one of the things that we see, there's a contrast within the Namwanga area. In the urban setting in the Namwanga area, most of the children in the classes that were observed were speaking Bemba fluently and had interactions more in Bemba, and there was much more interference from the teacher that they should be speaking in Bemba. Whereas in the more rural settings in the Namwanga area, there was much more allowance of interaction in Namwanga, like in this class. Even though the teacher comes back, speaking in Bemba, the kids were not actively stopped from speaking in Namwanga. So this is an interview that Joseph had with a head teacher, a deputy head teacher, in asking what was the language policy, and he says, I'm going to play to you, I think it's the actual one, but he sort of essentially is saying what we are supposed to do is to follow this familiar language medium of instruction, so that the instruction should be both in Bemba and English, and we never actively forbid students from speaking in Namwanga. And then Joseph sort of says, oh, that's good that you don't stop them from speaking in another language. And then the head teacher says, well, of course, it also depends. If the teacher doesn't speak Namwanga, then there is a language barrier. And it's really interesting in terms of switching languages, how when the head teacher speaks, he sort of says in Bemba, some of them, they fail to answer. So he says that part in Bemba, and then after that, he just says language barrier. Like, they fail to answer, and the reason why they fail to answer is because there's a language barrier. So listen to this.
So language barrier. Okay. So grade one. Like by but that will also depend on the
So you can see there's also quite a little bit of mixing with English here as well. I didn't even notice that so much. So he says, well, actually, advise grade one, and then everything else is in Bemba, discourage. And then here as well, he says, but it also depends, and then says the rest of it in Bemba. This interview, and you can see, Joseph is making an effort. This whole sentence from Joseph, the one but last one, everything he says is absolutely in Bemba, like trying to sort of make this, we are speaking in Bemba, is absolutely comfortable, but it's a very natural thing that the deputy head teacher then speaks in different languages. So now we're coming to the final three extracts that we want to share. So these are views of parents. So there were interviews also conducted with parents and trying to gauge what they think. And there was mixed views. Some parents felt like it was good to start with Bemba, and others felt like it would be better to start with English. So here Joseph just gives an explanation which covers the next two slides.
In the interviews with parents, we were also asked about the language of instruction. We were also asked about the languages that they used in various domains. Many of the parents felt that their children should start learning English early. And this was because they felt English was so important, it is needed for employment, it has to be introduced early. So for some of these parents, the use of Zambian languages in the initial stages is like taking away time for learning English. But there are also equally some parents who felt that the local language, Bemba in particular, was important and should be learned well, and English is something that learners can learn later. There were cases when parents were asked whether they didn't feel there was a problem if they didn't participate in the learner's education, for example, in helping with homework. In cases where the parents were unable to speak English. As we'll see later, one of the parents actually suggested that sometimes parents used examples which teachers had given the learners at school and used those to help their children answer questions that they had been given to work on.
So you can see here in the second line of what the parent says, there's a very nice construction here in Bemba where you don't usually have double negation in Bemba, but this is one of the ones where he has a double negation. So he says in the second line, the star is a negation, and then he has yo, which is no. So he says he won't write an application in Bemba and be understood no, because it's really like, that's just, it's not useful for him to learn Bemba because otherwise he won't be able to write an application. This is the one that Joseph talked about where there was a question, how would you help, if you sort of insist that English should be used from the start when they go to school, how would you help those kids? So then this parent says that, well, usually when you learn, there must be some example that you were given. So then you would ask the children and negotiate it by saying, what kind of example were you given? And then you'll be able to give them some support. This is the final one that Joseph talked to, a lady who was of the opposing opinion, who sort of, said that, well, she felt that Bemba was important, and this is Joseph's explanation.
In another interview, an elderly lady in this particular case explained that the children needed to learn Bemba, they needed to learn their language. And even if they were not allowed to write applications in Bemba, they will of course learn English later, which is the way it is actually, that you start with a local language and then you go into English. And this lady was even talking about the use of English, which officially is the language of government. But in many offices, the officers there understand the local language, and that is what is desirable. And that when they are visited by people who don't speak English, they communicate with them in the local language, like in this case, Bemba.
Very wise lady, and a very good point to end on. So we come to our conclusions. So from the cases that we looked at today, there seems to be certain disconnects. So there's a disconnect between what teachers say, what the head teacher say, that you're allowed to use a familiar language, and what you actually see in the classroom. So in the cases that we showed you, we also showed some Namwanga being allowed. We've got other examples where you see in the town setting that students are told that you shouldn't speak in Namwanga, you should speak in Bemba. So that's against actually what the policy says. There's also a disconnect between the familiar language policy and the classroom practice, particularly in the more urban areas. So there's this rural-urban setting even within this area. So learners in rural areas were more free to use Namwanga in class compared to the town setting. And then we also saw at the very end that some parents wanted their children to start learning English, and maybe perhaps this is because there isn't a good understanding that literacy skills that are learned in the local language can be successfully used to transition into literacy in English. And that's it. Thank you very much, in many multiple different languages. So Tracy,
brilliant.
The questions for us.
Hello, thank you. Yes, thank you to Colin, Nancy and Joseph for talking so splendidly about our project. We have a few moments left for questions or comments. If anybody has any, I can keep monitoring the chat function there. If people want to type in any questions, that would be wonderful. We did have a comment about from Frederica about the research principles, so and liking those, so that's great, thank you. And another question here: is our work published? Not as yet. We have some in the pipeline, don't we? We have a blog posts that are active, and that we continue to add to that. So we've started to write a bit about the work that we're doing there, and we have hopefully the Babel, sorry, my terrible pronunciation, magazine hopefully coming out soon. I think that's okay to share that with colleagues, isn't it? So yeah, certainly things will be in the pipeline. We were hoping, I guess, to be a bit further along. I'm guessing the same with most people's research at this current time, to have a few more findings. But obviously, COVID-19, having closed a number of schools everywhere, has caused something of a delay. So, right, here we go. There's coming in now. So lots of, absolutely, a comment here about the complexity of classroom practice and sort of, what's happening within the classroom and how that mirrors or not what happens outside of the classroom. So a question from Lutz. If I were Edgar Lungu, do you think there's a need for me to set up different policies? And so how... I guess sort of, I mean, my own personal view on that would be that I don't know whether anybody, if this is a sort of a government, but whether they're in the best position to set up policies, and whether or not we do need to sort of start from more policies being slightly more community-based or kind of more bottom-up rather than kind of more top-down policies, particularly around things to do with language and education that are not always necessarily, or I'm speaking for the context of the UK anyway, that haven't always been implemented based on what's best for learning or what's best for showing learning or developing learning. So if we continue with those types of approaches, then actually, do we, is there a way that we can perceive of language policies that are teacher-based or community-based or student-based, even, dare I say it? How exciting that, we would actually hear from the people who are, who these policies impact. So I think, yes, there is a need for different policies, but who is best placed to develop those, I think is an interesting question. And again, kind of that should not be in the hands of a single entity, that, given the complexity of language use and language practices, the language planning also needs to be sort of complex, again, in its sense of who is involved in it, not complex to the point that it becomes unwieldy, but to, so that there are multiple voices being heard. I don't know if anyone else wants to comment on that too, but.
Yeah, no, I would certainly agree with that, Tracy. But the other thing is also maybe that one needs even more support, even for some policies which are not so bad. So in principle, the use of familiar language for the kids policy from the 2013 language and education policy in Zambia is actually supportive of use of different languages, but that doesn't seem to be happening on the ground. So maybe it's also, you make a policy, but then what are you doing to make sure that it actually works, that people feel supported, that they can actually do it? Because saying that they can use a familiar language means that it doesn't have to be one of the 7 national languages. It could be anything that the kids are familiar with in the region, but that doesn't seem to be happening very much. As well, maybe because they don't feel very supported. So yeah, certainly.
Certainly. Another question here from Ian. We hear so often that teachers are not assigned to their home areas for fear of tribalism. I wonder how real that fear is. And do we know of examples of countries in Africa where teachers are successfully assigned to their home area without creating issues of tribalism? That is a really interesting question, isn't it? I mean, I think if people have answers to that as well, then feel free to add those into the chat box as well. But I think one of the things that seems to be interesting about the teachers anyway is that regardless of where teachers are assigned to, I think there's lots of sort of examples of teachers adjusting to local contexts as well, or, resorting to kind of their own language practices anyway. So to what extent the policy actually on a longer term basis influences what teachers do. I think there's an interesting account from Botswana, isn't there, of a teacher who was posted to an area where she didn't speak the local language, but of course it ended up, she was there for a number of years, so then ended up learning the local dialects and using those languages anyway. So there's always ways around those policies, aren't there? And the notion of tribalism is interesting, isn't it? I think.
That's true.
Yeah. And so a question also about sort of Colin or Nancy or Hannah. So I'm wondering about the possible impact of closeness and remoteness in the multilingual interactions. So i.e. Uiji Mwanga might be fairly easy to understand to and from Bemba, but this would be very different from, say, Tswana and the Khoisan languages, if that's anything that people want to talk to.
So sorry, what was the question? That that it might be easy to have a multilingual policy when the languages are similar to each other?
Or the nature of the the closeness and remoteness of the languages and how that impacts on multilingual interactions, whether that makes it easier or more difficult, I guess.
Of course, the more different that the languages are, and in a way, maybe it depends more on how the communities live. So if they're very far away from each other and they're not interacting so much, then of course it's going to be much more difficult, which makes it why in Botswana, the San are very negatively impacted by the use of Setswana, because they don't use Setswana very much. So in this context in which we had in Zambia, it's not the worst one, it's true, because within the community, clearly they seem to be at least bilingual, that they would use Namwanga and English. But as you could see from those statistics that Joseph was talking about, it seems to be that the Namwanga speakers speak more Bemba more often. I think it was like 39% or something, whereas it was 0.3% of Bemba speakers who spoke Namwanga. But I think in a way, it's even when the languages are similar, it seems as if these learners, these children, are comfortable in two languages, and it would be nice if they would be able to learn in the two languages that are sort of available, rather than sort of, you know, give them one of those. So it seems as if maybe a more multilingual policy would be better. So then also in a context like in Botswana, that if it wasn't only Setswana, it was Setswana and as well as the San languages, then that would make it much easier, I should imagine.
Yeah. And there's a question as well about, are teachers receiving professional development on ways to respect Namwanga when students speak it and engage them in the use of Bemba rather than correcting it? And so in the data that we've got so far, we don't have anything from teachers where they've talked about how they manage those interactions. And it does seem as though there's a lot of, and again, this is sort of what you would expect, I think anyway, but a lot of individual classroom practice and possibly, you know, within certain schools, there might be quite different practices across the neighbouring schools, etc., etc. So I think even within schools, teachers seem to be kind of have different attitudes about how they are approaching different language uses, their own as well as the students, and whether there would be direct correction, whether they would sort of let it go, when they make decisions about corrections, etc. So that is something I think that we would kind of hopefully be able to dig down into a bit more in kind of in future data as well, and certainly something to look at. I don't think we have anything so far on explicit policies that teachers are told to do or not to do. Again, that seems to be from the data that we've got something localized to the schools as well. So some head teachers said, yes, they had a very clear policy. But again, in talking, the teachers would say, well, in our staff meetings or in, you know, chats with students, it's sort of, you know, it's multilingual anyway, even though the medium of instruction of the school might be formally stated as something else. So again, and I think this links to one of the points from Rachel as well about whether or not, you know, how we reconcile gaps between different views of language and what people are doing. And I think I think for us, maybe, I think for me anyway, I'm speaking on behalf of us, sorry, but one of the things I think is sort of important is that sort of, you know, it's not necessarily our own views of these languages or how languages are being used, but how policy views what is happening and what actually happens in real life day-to-day context. And I think that's the sort of tension that we are interested in talking to, really. So to what extent is what we're seeing in the classrooms, is that what policy is sort of intending, and how do we sort of address that, and how can we make policies more responsive in a way to what is happening in classrooms? So empowering teachers to be able to make perhaps different choices about how they engage with the languages that the students are learning, or, you know, for students themselves actually to be able to, and it seems in the data that students are sort of, in some circumstances, feel freely able to move between those languages, and that's great. But what we might see, and again, I think this happens in other contexts as well, is in the younger years where students are perhaps a bit more sort of fluid, a bit more sort of less restrained, if you like, by the policy. But as we go up into secondary school, sometimes the use of local languages, or that ability to move between, or willingness to trans-language, perhaps trails off a bit, where people are concerned about grades and exams, or sort of formalized processes in that sense. So, you know, forward looking, that if we can sort of have policies that are engaging with people's languages right from the start, that actually those things might end up being in more in balance all the way through their education, as opposed to it being a switch to, you know, a dominant prestige form. So kind of questioning those dominant practices, I guess. And that seems at the moment from some of the data that we're getting that, of course, we know from sort of how we know that people are interacting, and from the number of languages that we know that in schools and in classrooms, students will be doing different things. That's sort of the reality of it, isn't it? But making sure that that's a space that is protected for people and kind of promoted rather than being something that people are kind of pushed away from, I think would be interesting. I don't know, hopefully that sort of might address some of the questions. I don't know if there are any further comments or anything people wanted to make. I'll just have another quick scan through the questions to make sure I haven't missed anything, sorry.
It will also really be very, in the context of what we have seen in Zambia, it will really be interesting to see what happens in Botswana and in Tanzania, because the contexts are going to be very different, because there's a big dominant language, which is the main language. And I think the policy of saying use a familiar language is certainly something we don't have in Botswana and in Tanzania. So it will really be interesting to see what's going on there. Given the number of languages that we have seen, for example, in Tanzania, it's going to be very complex in terms of how the students interact. So it would be really interesting to see, by comparison, what's going to happen in the classrooms, because I would expect that maybe there'll be much more control in trying to sort of Swahili.
Yeah, and I just sort of, sorry, just tracking back here, that there was a comment about the idea of policies being subverted, and I think that that's a really interesting idea, isn't it? And a constant, I think, with any kind of policy, that things are always realised in practice, aren't they? And to a certain extent, policies are problems for people to respond to, aren't they? So often policies are presented as being a solution to things, and I think it's sort of Stephen Ball, isn't he, who talks about policies, but actually they're not really like that at all. They're problems, and they create problems for people. So how do people respond? And I think this idea of, how are people in these different contexts responding to those policies? And that, I think we were talking, a comment from Frederica again about sort of Quranic education or village assemblies, where there may be more multilingual practices happening. So in the sort of subsequent stages of our research, obviously for the moment, all of these things are kind of on hold a bit, or perhaps taking slightly different formats to how we'd originally planned. But as soon as we are able to move a little more freely, we were certainly, one of the things that we were hoping to do is to record some of those same students and some of those same teachers, both within schools, but also in their day-to-day lives outside of classrooms as well. So to what extent are what the children doing at home with their parents, in play, wherever they are, whatever they're doing, is that similar to the types of language and the types of styles that they're using in classrooms as well? So hopefully in the next stages of our project, we will be looking more at student attitudes, kind of more community-based activities as well, in terms of the types of things that people are, the types of language that they're being used in, and the types of spaces that they're being used in as well. Because again, that gives us more power to speak to those policies around where things are fitting or not, and where changes might be able to be made, I think.
Excellent. Colin, do you just want to give us a little advert for next week's talk?
Sure. So our next talk will be on the 11th of September at the same time, and Professor Leon Tickley will be discussing some work that him and his team have conducted in Rwanda, which mainly involves creating multilingual textbooks and things like that. So more information about that talk will be up on our website soon, and you can register for it there, just where you've registered for all the rest of the talks in the series.
Brilliant. Thank you, everybody. There are some, if we've missed any sort of further comments or questions, we'll sort of add things to the website, and the recording should be there as well. So there is a good question about signage and context of examples of companies using translanguaging. And so there are some great examples from Tanzania that we can perhaps share via the website as well. So that'd be great. So thank you, everybody, for coming. Thank you again to Nancy, Colin and Joseph for such wonderful talking about our project. And we'll see you again in a couple of weeks. Thanks again, and have a nice afternoon.